The rain hit the desert like it didn't belong there. Soft, hesitant, almost apologetic. But it still fell. Clara stood in the doorway of the burned-down chapel, a shotgun in one hand, her wedding dress torn and caked in soot. Behind her, the preacher was dead. In front of her, 5 men on horseback circled like wolves, their laughter mean and cold. And in the center of it all, half buried in the ash and dust, was the one thing she never thought she'd cry over. His hat. The same hat she once kicked into the fire during their first fight. The same hat he never went anywhere without. Now it was the only part of him left. Before we jump back in, introduce yourself and let me know where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. There were 3 churches in Dry Creek and only 2 had roofs. The third, First Light Baptist, had been struck by lightning 5 years ago and no one bothered to rebuild it. Its charred steeple still pointed to a God no one believed in anymore. The townsfolk called it cursed. Clara called it the only place where no one stared. Dry Creek wasn't a town for the soft-hearted. It was a place where secrets hung in the heat like flies over a carcass. You didn't get far unless you married rich, rode fast, or kept your mouth shut. Clara had done none of those things. She walked with a limp, her right leg dragging ever so slightly from an accident no one cared to remember. Her face, once the talk of Sunday socials, was marked now by a scar that ran from her cheekbone to the edge of her jaw. Clean, pink, and unmistakable. A permanent reminder of a husband who drank more than he prayed. When he died in a bar fight 2 winters ago, no one mourned him, and no one brought Clara soup or sweetbread either. Some said she killed him herself. Others whispered she cursed him with silence. She hadn't spoken a full sentence since the funeral. No one knew the truth, and no one asked. The school teacher, Miss Eliza, had once tried to befriend her. Left a basket of lemons and white lilies on her porch. The next day, the basket was gone and Clara never said a word. After that, even Eliza kept her distance. She lived on the edge of town, in a wind-beaten house that creaked when the wind changed. It had no fence, no dog, and no laughter inside. The porch sagged. The windows blinked with dust. But it stood, just like Clara. She spent her days with her hands in soil, planting what little the desert would allow. Rosemary, wild onions, a few stubborn sunflowers that refused to die. She liked things that didn't need much, things that grew in silence. People saw her once a week, maybe twice. She walked to town on Tuesdays to buy sugar and on Fridays to visit the graveyard. Her husband was buried there, but she never looked at his headstone. Her sister Mary was 2 plots down. That's who she talked to. Still quiet out here, she'd whisper. You'd like that. Before we dive deeper into the story, just a quick note. I'm Thomas, the voice behind this narration. If you enjoy how it sounds, let me know in the comments so we can keep the same voice in future videos. Now, let's go back to where it really started. It was a Thursday the first time she saw him, not a Friday, not her usual trip. She'd run out of flour and couldn't stomach another week of cornmeal. She stepped into Marston's general store with the bell above the door clinking once. Marston didn't look up. He never did, but someone else did. He stood by the coffee barrels, dust-covered from boots to hat, with a rifle strapped across his back and a saddlebag over his shoulder. His shirt was the kind of white that only poor men wore, too bright, too honest. His boots weren't polished, his knuckles were scratched, and he had a scar running through one eyebrow. Their eyes met, just for a second. She looked away first. "Howdy, ma'am," he said, soft as smoke. She didn't answer. Just moved toward the shelf and picked up her sack of flour. Marston grunted behind the counter. "Don't waste your breath on her." She, "Don't talk. Not since her man died." The cowboy didn't respond, just nodded once and tipped his hat when Clara passed him on the way out. Outside, the wind was picking up. A sandstorm was coming. Clara pulled her shawl tighter and walked on, head down, boots crunching over gravel in silence. She didn't look back, but he did. That night, the wind howled through the boards of her home like a crying child. She lit a lamp and sat by the window, watching as the storm turned the world to gold and gray. In her lap was a needle and thread. She was stitching a hem that didn't need stitching, just something to do with her hands. And her mind wandered back to the store, to the way his voice didn't sound like the others, how he didn't flinch at her silence. Most men saw her limp, her scar, her eyes too tired to fight, and turned away, but he didn't look away. He looked at her, like she was still someone. She shook the thought loose. Men like that came through, Dry Creek all the time, gunslingers, gamblers, ghosts, and they all left. Let him ride on, she told herself. He'll be gone by morning. But she was wrong. He stayed. He wasn't gone by morning. By Sunday, he'd fixed the livery roof. By Monday, he was hauling water from the well behind Miss Eliza's schoolhouse. By Tuesday, he had a name. Colton Briggs. No, one knew where he'd come from, or where he was headed. But he kept to himself, and in Dry Creek that was usually enough. Usually. Clara saw him again outside the blacksmith's a week after their first meeting. He was hammering a horseshoe, his shirt rolled to the elbows, sweat darkening the fabric. His movements were precise, deliberate, unbothered by the stares of the men watching him from the saloon. One of them muttered something. Clara couldn't hear what, but she saw the way Colton straightened, just slightly, like a dog who heard a growl behind a closed door. She paused in the street, the sack of sugar heavy in her arms. He looked up. Another look. Another heartbeat. This time he smiled. Just a corner of his mouth. Nothing showy. Nothing he expected her to return. But something in her chest shifted. So faint, she barely noticed it. That Friday, she found him leaning against the fence near the graveyard. "Don't mean to disturb you," he said when she approached. She stopped, said nothing. He nodded toward the plot where her sister lay. "Good place to sit quiet, huh?" Still, no answer. Clara's throat tightened. She wanted to speak. The words were there, somewhere, under dust and grief and silence. But all she did was nod, and he seemed fine with that. They didn't speak often, but they found each other more. At the well, at the post, at the edge of the chapel ruins, where she sometimes sat to sketch wildflowers in a notebook no one had seen before. Once, he saw her limp worsen and offered her his arm. She didn't take it. But she didn't look away either, Dry Creek noticed. Old Mrs. Jennings whispered about the widow and the drifter. The preacher warned of temptation in the form of silence and sweat. And the sheriff? He watched them both like he was waiting for someone to blink because Colton had secrets. That much was clear. Some nights, lights flickered in the desert hills. Some said it was bandits, others said gold hunters. But Clara heard whispers. Colton had enemies, men with no names, men who followed dust trails like bloodhounds. And yet he never looked afraid, just tired, like her. One evening, Clara stood outside her house as the sun slipped behind the hills, lighting the sky with bruised oranges and dying gold. She heard footsteps, deliberate, measured, and didn't need to turn. Colton stopped a few paces behind her. "You got a sunset worth watching," he said. She nodded. "It's quieter out here." The words startled even her. He blinked, but didn't comment. "Good kind of quiet," he said softly. She turned toward him, eyes cautious. "Most folks don't stay." He tilted his head. "You don't strike me as most folks." And there it was again. That shift. That crack in the wall she'd built. Not forced, not stolen, just offered. They stood like that for a while. The silence wasn't awkward. It was heavy, like old music you hadn't heard in years, but still knew the tune to. Mid-scene break. What if someone saw you for who you are, not what you carry? Subscribe. One day that story might be yours too. The next morning Colton didn't show up. Not at the blacksmith's, not by the well, not near the chapel ruins. By noon people were talking, rode off with a bottle and a bad idea, someone said. "Heard he owed the wrong folks money," another muttered. But Clara's gut said something else. That evening, she left a jar of honey biscuits on the chapel pew, just in case. The next morning, they were gone. He showed up a day later, bloodied, shirt torn, limping worse than her. She found him by the old oak behind the chapel. He was on one knee, trying to clean a cut with water from his canteen. Clara didn't ask questions, just handed him her scarf and sat down beside him. "I didn't want to bring that kind of trouble near you," he whispered. "But trouble don't always ask permission." She didn't flinch at the sight of his bruises. He glanced at her, tired eyes searching. "I don't know who told you silence means weakness, but they were wrong." Her lips parted. "And I don't know who told you pain means you gotta leave." They sat like that until the stars came out, drawing maps they'd never seen before. The sheriff paid Clara a visit 2 days later. Hat in hand, fake kindness in his eyes. "You know who that man is?" he asked, standing on her porch. Clara didn't answer. "He's wanted in 2 counties, not for robbery, not for murder, for protecting the wrong girl in the wrong town." Still, she said nothing. The sheriff leaned in. "Folks are watching you, Clara. Watching him." As he turned to leave, Clara said it clearly without shaking, "Then they can keep watching." From that moment she knew. It wasn't love, not yet. It was trust, the kind that crept in slowly, like desert water after a long drought. You didn't notice it at first. But one day, your roots weren't dry anymore. The storm didn't start with thunder. It started with whispers, rumors sharp as thorns, curling around town like wildfire through dry brush. She lured him here. She's protecting him because she's guilty too. Men don't bleed for women like her unless they're hiding something. Clara knew better than to listen, but the old wound, the one made of stares and silence, began to ache again, like it always did when people needed someone to hate, quietly. That morning she found her front door smeared with red paint. "Witch," it said. The word dripped like blood. By afternoon, the sheriff came knocking again, this time not to talk. "Colton Briggs skipped bail in Texas," he said. "He laid low here waiting out trouble, and you helped." She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She only asked, "Is he safe?" The sheriff raised an eyebrow. "You care more about him than your own name?" She looked him in the eye. "I lost my name a long time ago." He left her with a warning. If he stays, the town won't. That night, her windows shattered. Rocks through glass. Laughter in the dark. No one saw. No one helped. Except Colton. He came silently. Not to rescue. To listen. He didn't touch the broken glass. Didn't promise revenge. Just stood with her as she swept it up. Later, she sat by the hearth, her hands shaking as she held the scarf he'd once bled on. It still carried a faint stain. "You should go," she whispered. He sat across from her, quiet for a long time. "I've run all my life," he finally said. "But I never found anything worth staying for until I found you." She looked up, tears stinging. "Why me?" "Because you didn't ask me to be more than I am. And you didn't look away." She almost told him then, about the scars on her back, the night her husband died, the fire that took her sister, the baby she lost before anyone knew she was pregnant. But she didn't have to, because he already knew. Not the facts, but the weight, the kind you carry in your eyes. 2 days later, the betrayal came. It wasn't from a stranger. It was from Abigail Monroe, the one woman who used to bring Clara soup when her leg gave out. She was caught snooping through Clara's garden. When Clara confronted her, Abigail snapped, "We were warned. You were always cursed. This is your doing." By nightfall, a petition circulated. Clara should leave Dry Creek, for good. She ran, not with dignity, not with bags packed, with shaking hands and no coat. The wind tore at her as she limped toward the hills. Snow had started to fall, not enough to bury, just enough to freeze skin. She didn't know where she was going, just away. She collapsed near a frozen creek bed, her breath visible, her palms cut on ice. No one would find her. No one should. But someone did. Colton didn't arrive like a hero. He didn't ride in on a horse, didn't shout her name through the canyon. He just walked, and when he saw her, he didn't speak. Didn't scold. He took off his coat, wrapped it around her shoulders, sat beside her in the snow, both of them trembling. She broke first. "I thought I could handle it," she whispered, teeth chattering. He looked at her gently. "You shouldn't have to. I'm not strong." "I know," he said. "But you're real. That's rarer." She sobbed then, not because of the cold, but because someone stayed. They didn't go back that night. They built a fire by the creek, shared stale biscuits from his pocket, and watched the stars blink open. At some point he reached for her hand, not forcefully, just enough to ask. She gave it to him. Not because she was healed, but because for once, someone wasn't trying to fix her. Back in Dry Creek, they expected her gone, but she returned. Slowly, quietly, with a man at her side who didn't carry a gun like a threat but like a promise. No one said much. But when Clara opened her bakery again, just 2 weeks later, someone left a letter under the door. No name, just 6 words. "Sorry, we saw too late." They thought she was broken, but someone saw gold in the ashes. The wind carried judgment in this town, but Clara no longer flinched when it howled. Let them whisper. She had lived in silence long enough to understand its language. And Colton, he stood beside her not as a shield but as a mirror. He reflected who she was, not what they said. Together, they began again. It started with one hammer, one beam. They rebuilt the old barn behind her cottage, not to store cattle, but to start something neither had dared dream of, a horse rescue ranch. She had grown up with horses before the fire took everything. He had broken wild Mustangs in Arizona before prison took years he couldn't reclaim. Now, they gathered what was left and made it useful. Each morning, Clara fed the animals while Colton mended the stalls. She painted signs with her bad leg propped on a hay bale. He trained the younger horses with a patience she'd only ever seen. In those who had suffered deeply, they didn't call it healing. They didn't call it anything. But something inside her, something that had frozen years ago, began to thaw. Then came the knock. Not the sheriff, not the townsfolk, but a man in a brown coat with a federal badge and a steely look that didn't soften, even when Colton stepped forward with calm eyes. "Colton Briggs," the man said, "you've been declared a fugitive in 3 states. I need you to come with me." Clara's voice cracked. "What if he doesn't?" The agent didn't blink. "Then I bring him in myself." That night, they didn't sleep. Colton sat on the porch with a bottle of rye. Clara curled in a blanket beside him. The stars were dim. Even the sky seemed undecided. "I won't run again," he said. She didn't ask him to. "But if I turn myself in," he continued, "I might not come back." Clara looked down at her hands, calloused from weeks of work. "Then why did you come to Dry Creek?" she asked softly. He thought for a long time. "Because I was tired of running from who I am." Then she turned to him and said what had been building in her since the creek. "Then don't run. Stand. Here. With me." They had 24 hours before the marshal returned, so they made the most of it. They built a fire in the barn, shared a dinner of eggs and stale bread. She wore her sister's old shawl, the only thing that had survived the fire. He pulled a ring from his coat pocket, a thin silver band, tarnished but whole. "I stole it once," he said, "from a man who didn't deserve it." She smiled. Then maybe it was always meant for a better purpose. They didn't have a priest. They didn't need one. Just her hand in his breath in the cold, and the fire that refused to die, the sigh. Next morning, Clara stood at the town square head high. The lawman came with iron cuffs. Colton held out his wrists. No fight, no plea. But just before the chains closed, Clara stepped forward and handed the agent a letter. Her fingers trembled, but her voice did not. "It's from the governor of Texas," she said. "A pardon, signed last week, on one condition, that he serve this town, not prison." The agent frowned. "How did you get this?" "I wrote," she said. "Every day for 6 months." He looked at Colton, then at her. Then he nodded. You bought him time. Let's see if he earns it. Colton didn't say thank you. He didn't have to. Instead, he picked up a shovel, and they built the rest of their home, together. But the final test was not over, because one night, when the fire burned low and she stared into its flickering glow, he asked, "Do you still see the girl you were before the world broke her?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked to the door, opened it, and stared out at the horses grazing in the moonlight. "I don't see her," she whispered, "but I see what she became." He joined her there, and together they watched the wind carry the ashes away, not of pain, but of the past. The autumn came early that year, earlier than expected, quieter than remembered. Dry creeks dirt. Roads were softer now, shaped by boots that no longer trampled but stayed a while. The town was changing little by little, but old eyes watched harder when hearts tried to bloom, especially when the blooming came from someone like Clara, and the man beside her. To some, still a ghost of wrongs. To others, a puzzle not worth solving. The town council had called a vote. It wasn't just about the horse ranch anymore. It was about whether Colton could stay, not on paper, but in spirit, among the people, without whispers, without suspicion. He could walk away and be safe. The pardon held. The ranch was hers. But to truly live here, with her, he'd have to stand in front of the town, name her as his, and face every pair of narrowed eyes. "I don't care what they think," Clara had said, but she did. Not because she needed their approval, because she was tired of being half alive. The church bell rang at noon. A meeting, they called it, but everyone knew it was a trial without robes or judges, just folded arms and hushed tones. Clara waited. Outside, dressed simple, hair pinned back with an old ribbon her mother once wore. Colton hadn't come yet. People glanced at her, some with pity, others with judgment dressed as kindness. Mrs. Tannen passed by and muttered, "He's not worth the waiting." Clara didn't flinch, because she'd already waited for years for someone to see her whole. Then the doors creaked. Boots echoed on wood. He walked in slow, shoulders straight. Not defiant, just grounded. Colton tipped his hat to the mayor, then looked at every face, even the ones that turned away. Then he looked at Clara, not with apology, but with awe, like she was the one saving him. "I've done wrong," he said to the crowd, "more than you'll ever know. But I never lied to her." Silence. She saw me before I did. Saw good where there wasn't much left. And I'd rather be hated here, beside her, than loved anywhere else without her. He turned to her, fully. "I want this town to know one thing. I choose her." A hush. Then somewhere near the back, the old postmaster stood and tipped his hat. "She chose you long before we ever had a say." They didn't throw rice. There were no violins, just a clearing behind the barn, and lanterns hung in the trees, and a few townsfolk who stayed, not out of curiosity, but something that felt closer to hope. Clara wore no veil, just the same ribbon. Colton wore his best, which wasn't much, but he wore it like armor polished with purpose. They didn't exchange rings, just vows, short, honest. He promised to build, not fix. She promised to love, not heal, and under a sky so wide it swallowed their shadows, they held hands like people who had finally earned each other. Later that night, as the wind picked up and the stars blinked above the hills, Clara leaned her head against his chest and whispered, "Do you still feel like you don't deserve this?" He looked out at the flickering barn light. "I don't," she smiled. "Good, because neither do I." The ranch grew, slowly. Horses came in broken and left breathing freer. Townsfolk began to nod instead of stare. Some even asked for help when their colts grew wild. Children pointed at Clara when she rode past, not in fear, but with curiosity. "Is that the lady who tames the wild ones?" And sometimes, when the dust blew soft over the fence line and the sun melted over the hills, she'd sit in the rocking chair by the porch and press her hand to her belly. Not quite showing. Not yet, but enough to know something new was on its way. A season later, on the first snowfall, they named their daughter Ruth, after her sister. "She'd have liked that," Clara whispered. Colton nodded. "She would have liked you." They never left Dry Creek, because you don't run from redemption once it finally finds you. They simply lived, fully, fiercely, and side by side. She was never a curse. She was someone's miracle all along. If you have any suggestions to improve our videos, please let us know in the comments. We're a new channel, and your feedback truly helps us grow.